The family portraits on the mantelpiece depicted smiling faces, a picture of suburban contentment in Cary, North Carolina. This home, nestled on a quiet street lined with mature oaks, seemed to embody a certain American ideal. The lawn was meticulously manicured, the porch swing swayed gently in the breeze, and the curtains in the front windows were always neatly drawn, suggesting a life lived in perfect order. It was here that David and Martha lived, raising their only son, Thomas. Thomas grew up, went to college, and eventually brought Anne home. Anne was bright, effervescent, a stark contrast to the quiet reserve that often settled over the family like the evening dew. Their wedding was a small affair, held in the garden behind the house, under a trellis Martha had painstakingly decorated with roses. The photographs from that day, added to the collection on the mantel, showed Thomas beaming, Anne radiant in her white dress, and David standing slightly apart, a hand resting awkwardly on Thomas's shoulder, a polite smile fixed on his face. Martha, ever the watchful matriarch, stood beside Anne, her expression unreadable behind her own smile. The early years of Thomas and Anne's marriage seemed, from the outside, uneventful and happy. They bought a small house themselves, only a few miles away in the same town, close enough for Sunday dinners but far enough for independence. Anne worked as a teacher at a local elementary school, her days filled with the cheerful chaos of young children. Thomas worked for a software company in the Research Triangle Park, his life structured by deadlines and code. David, retired from a long career in accounting, spent his days tending his garden and involved in local church activities. Martha volunteered at the library and managed the household affairs with quiet efficiency. Their lives were defined by routine, by predictable rhythms that promised security and peace. But underneath the surface of this placid existence, currents were beginning to stir, unseen and unacknowledged. There were subtle shifts in interaction, glances that lingered too long, conversations that seemed to carry unspoken weight. The house on the quiet street held its secrets close, its walls absorbing the silence that grew between certain members of the family. The mail still arrived each day. The papers were delivered to the porch. The routines continued uninterrupted. Yet, the perfect picture on the mantelpiece, and the life it represented, was far more fragile than anyone outside the family could possibly imagine. The carefully constructed facade of normality was about to be tested, not by external forces, but by something festering within its very core, a hidden truth that would soon shatter the peace of this quiet North Carolina town. This initial period, looking back, was marked by an almost deliberate ignorance, a collective turning away from whatever might have been perceived as slightly off-key in the family's harmony. The air remained thick with the scent of roses and cut grass, masking the scent of something else entirely, something acrid and hidden just beneath the surface of everyday life. The quiet suburban existence offered no protection from the storm brewing within the family's private world, a storm that would eventually break with devastating force, leaving nothing untouched. The first cracks were almost imperceptible, like hairline fractures in glass. Anne found herself spending more time at David and Martha's house, sometimes alone when Thomas was working late. It started innocuously enough, helping Martha with canning, discussing lesson plans over coffee, simply enjoying the company. David was often present, initially receding into the background, absorbed in his newspaper or garden catalogs, but gradually, his presence became more pronounced. He would join their conversations, his comments initially reserved, then becoming more familiar, more personal. He seemed to find Anne's energy and openness refreshing, a contrast to Martha's quiet demeanor. Martha, for her part, seemed content to let Anne and David interact, occasionally offering a brief smile or comment before returning to her tasks. She had always been a woman of few words, her thoughts often kept behind a placid expression. Neighbors later recalled seeing Anne's car parked outside the house on weekdays, thinking nothing of it. Families visited each other. There was nothing outwardly suspicious about a daughter-in-law spending time with her in-laws. Yet looking back, these visits began to take on a different character. The initial purpose, helping Martha, seemed to fade, replaced by prolonged conversations with David, on the porch or in the living room. Topics ranged from his garden to Anne's work to broader discussions about life and faith. David, the reserved accountant, seemed to open up to Anne in a way he rarely did with others, sharing anecdotes from his youth and reflections on his retirement. Anne, with her empathetic nature, was a willing listener. The boundary between in-law relationship and something else began to blur subtly, almost imperceptibly. There was no single moment, no dramatic event that marked a clear shift. It was a slow, creeping evolution, like ivy slowly covering a wall, changing its appearance without anyone noticing the individual tendrils growing. Thomas remained largely unaware of the changing dynamic. His job demanded long hours, and when he was home, he and Anne focused on their shared life, planning weekends, discussing their days, navigating the everyday challenges of a young marriage. He trusted his wife completely, and he had no reason to doubt his father. The idea that anything untoward could be happening between them was simply outside the realm of his comprehension. His world was built on foundations of trust and familial loyalty. The possibility of betrayal, particularly betrayal of this nature, was unthinkable. He saw Anne's visits as a positive sign, evidence of her integration into his family, a strengthening of bonds that he cherished. He did not see the prolonged glances, the subtle physical proximity that sometimes occurred when they thought no one else was looking, the shared jokes or silences that held a different kind of intimacy. The air in the house on the quiet street seemed to grow heavier during these visits, charged with an unspoken energy. Martha remained present, a silent observer, her thoughts a mystery. Her routine continued, the library volunteering, the household management, but a certain stillness settled over her when Anne and David were engrossed in conversation. The subtle signs, visible only in hindsight, were there for anyone who might have been looking closely enough. But in the context of a seemingly normal family life, they were easily dismissed or misinterpreted. The narrative continued its steady progression, a quiet stream flowing towards a waterfall hidden just around the bend, its roar still unheard. As months turned into seasons, Anne began experiencing unusual symptoms: fatigue, recurrent infections, a general feeling of being unwell that lingered despite various remedies. Initially, she attributed it to stress from work or a prolonged viral infection. Teachers were often susceptible to whatever illnesses circulated in their classrooms. She visited her primary care physician in Cary, explaining her symptoms. The doctor performed standard tests, which initially yielded no clear diagnosis. As her condition failed to improve, and certain markers in her blood work showed irregularities, the physician recommended further testing, including a comprehensive panel. The process was gradual, unfolding over several weeks, a series of appointments, blood draws, and anxious waits for results. Anne continued her work, pushing through the fatigue, maintaining her outward composure. Thomas noticed she seemed tired, perhaps paler than usual, but accepted her explanations of stress or a persistent bug. His focus remained on his job and their shared future. The possibility of something serious, something life-altering, did not enter their minds. They were young, healthy, with their lives stretching out before them. The medical investigation proceeded methodically, a clinical process focused on identifying the root cause of her symptoms. The doctor, following established protocols, ordered tests that covered a range of possibilities, from autoimmune disorders to chronic infections. The language used in the consultations was technical, precise, focused on data and diagnostic pathways. Anne listened attentively, answering questions about her medical history and lifestyle, but the words themselves felt distant, abstract, not yet connected to a potentially devastating reality. The fear was present, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was the general, undefined fear of illness, not yet attached to a specific terrifying name. She continued to visit David and Martha, seeking comfort in their familiar presence, though the visits themselves had become tinged with her underlying anxiety about her health. David expressed concern, offering practical advice and quiet reassurances. Martha offered simple remedies and sympathetic glances. There was no indication, no sign from either of them, that they harbored any knowledge related to her deteriorating health. The facade remained intact, polished by routine and polite interaction. The medical process, designed to bring clarity, was instead building towards a revelation that would not only explain Anne's illness, but also expose a profound betrayal, shattering the foundations of trust and family. The waiting period between tests and results stretched, each day adding to the tension, the unknown becoming a heavy weight in the air. The clinical investigation was unknowingly converging with the hidden narrative of the family, the scientific facts about to collide with deeply personal secrets, creating an explosive and devastating outcome. The diagnosis was imminent, the quiet suburban life about to be irrevocably altered by a harsh medical truth. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while Anne was still at school. The doctor's tone was serious, professional, yet carrying a note of gravity that immediately heightened her anxiety. He asked her to come into the office as soon as possible, suggesting she bring someone with her if she wished. The phrasing was careful, clinical, but the implication was clear. The news was not good. Anne left school early, her mind racing, a cold knot forming in her stomach. She drove alone to the doctor's office in downtown Cary. The waiting room was quiet, filled with the usual collection of magazines and the low murmur of quiet conversations. When her name was called, she was led to a consultation room. The doctor sat behind his desk, the lab report open before him. He spoke calmly, using precise medical terminology, explaining the results of the comprehensive panel. He confirmed the presence of antibodies, followed by confirmation through subsequent tests. The diagnosis was human immunodeficiency virus. The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. Anne listened, her world tilting on its axis. She asked the immediate, necessary questions about treatment, prognosis, transmission. The doctor provided the clinical facts, outlining the current understanding of the virus, the available therapies, the importance of managing her health. He explained that HIV is typically transmitted through specific bodily fluids, most commonly through sexual contact or shared needles. Anne, who had always been meticulous about her health and relationships, struggled to process this information. She had been monogamous within her marriage to Thomas. The doctor, following protocol, discussed the importance of partner notification and testing. This clinical requirement immediately opened a chasm of possibility and fear. How could this be? Where could it have come from? As the initial shock began to subside, replaced by a wave of confusion and disbelief, Anne started to piece together the timeline, the possibility. Her mind raced through her life, her relationships. The implication of the diagnosis, given her history, was stark and unavoidable. It had to have come from her husband. She thought of Thomas, of their life together, of the trust they shared. The possibility of his infidelity, or perhaps an unknown past, was devastating. The conversation with the doctor continued, focusing on the medical aspects, but Anne's mind was already grappling with the personal implications. She left the office in a daze, the lab report clutched in her hand, the quiet streets of Cary now seeming alien and distant. The diagnosis was not just a medical one. It was a bomb dropped into the center of her life, sending shockwaves through her marriage and her family. The sterile environment of the doctor's office was the setting for a revelation that would unravel not only her health, but also the very fabric of her reality. The medical truth had arrived, stark and undeniable, and it demanded answers that would lead down a path of unimaginable pain and betrayal. The clinical clarity of the diagnosis stood in stark contrast to the emotional chaos it unleashed, marking the point of no return, the end of the life she knew and the beginning of a horrifying new reality. Armed with the devastating diagnosis, Anne returned home. Thomas was not yet back from work. She sat in their living room, the silence amplifying the turmoil in her mind. The lab report lay on the coffee table, a stark piece of paper outlining a horrifying truth. The doctor's words echoed in her ears. Transmission routes, partner notification. There was only one partner in her life. Her husband, Thomas. The logical conclusion, based on the medical information and her own history, pointed directly at him. The pain of the diagnosis was immediately compounded by the crushing weight of suspected betrayal. When Thomas arrived home, he found Anne visibly distressed. She sat him down, the report still on the table between them. With trembling hands, she explained the diagnosis, the medical facts, and the implications for transmission. As she spoke, the unspoken accusation hung heavy in the air. She looked at him, searching his face for an explanation, for a denial, for something that would make sense of this nightmare. Thomas was stunned. His initial reaction was one of shock and concern for Anne's health. But as the conversation progressed, and the issue of transmission became central, his confusion turned to disbelief. Anne stated the conclusion that seemed inevitable to her. He must have been unfaithful. The accusation was direct, born from the stark medical reality she had just been given. Thomas vehemently denied it. His denial was immediate and unequivocal. He insisted he had been faithful throughout their marriage. The conversation quickly devolved into a painful confrontation, a collision of Anne's medical truth and Thomas's assertion of innocence. Tears flowed, voices were raised, the quiet suburban home filled with the sound of anguish and disbelief. Anne, feeling betrayed and terrified by her diagnosis, clung to the medical facts as the only explanation. Thomas, blindsided and accused, struggled to comprehend how she could possibly believe he would do such a thing. The emotional intensity of the moment was overwhelming. As they argued, other possibilities were not immediately considered. The focus was solely on the perceived source of transmission. A partner. In her shock and pain, Anne fixated on the most obvious, most common route, and the man closest to her. The accusation was a raw expression of her fear, and her interpretation of the medical information she had just received. The air crackled with tension, the familiar rooms of their home suddenly feeling alien, tainted by suspicion and hurt. The conversation ended without resolution, the accusation made, the denial issued, leaving a chasm between them. Anne, in her devastation, held firm to her belief, fueled by the clinical reality of the diagnosis. Thomas, in his shock and hurt, felt unjustly accused, his trust in Anne shaken by her willingness to believe he was capable of such betrayal. The midpoint of the narrative was reached here, not with a forensic reveal in the traditional sense, but with a devastating personal twist. The victim, reeling from a medical blow, turned suspicion onto the person she should have been able to trust most, setting in motion a chain of events based on a tragically misplaced blame. The true source of the infection still lurking unseen in the shadows of their lives. The accusation was a direct consequence of the diagnosis, a painful misdirection born from immediate panic, and the seemingly undeniable logic of the medical facts presented. The accusation against Thomas sent ripples through the family, fracturing the carefully maintained facade of normalcy. Anne, standing by her belief that Thomas was the source of her infection, began to withdraw from him. The trust between them was shattered, replaced by suspicion and hurt. She discussed the situation, the diagnosis, and her conclusion, with her parents and a few close friends, though details of the family dynamics were often kept private. Thomas, reeling from the accusation and the devastation of Anne's illness, felt isolated and wrongly condemned. He maintained his innocence, but the burden of proof seemed impossible to bear. How could he prove a negative? How could he convince Anne, who was grappling with a life-altering diagnosis, that her logical conclusion based on medical facts was wrong? The conflict between Thomas and Anne intensified. Their home, once a place of shared life and comfort, became a battleground of accusation and denial. Simple interactions were strained, conversations were fraught with unspoken tension. The emotional distance between them grew with each passing day. Meanwhile, the news of Anne's illness, and the implied source, inevitably reached David and Martha. The information, however it was conveyed, arrived shrouded in the context of Anne's accusation against Thomas. Martha reacted with quiet distress, her usual reserve making it difficult to discern her deeper feelings. David's reaction was harder to read. He expressed concern for Anne, and appeared supportive of Thomas, offering vague words of comfort. But there was an underlying tension, a certain guardedness in his demeanor, that Anne, in her heightened state of awareness, began to notice. As Anne processed the diagnosis and the fallout with Thomas, her mind, initially focused on the immediate and obvious explanation, began to search for other possibilities, however remote. If Thomas was telling the truth, if he had not been unfaithful, where else could the infection have come from? The question, once unthinkable, slowly began to form in her mind. She revisited conversations with the doctor, the information about transmission routes. It wasn't solely sexual contact. Other avenues, less common but possible, existed. But given the nature of the virus and her history, sexual transmission remained the most probable explanation. If not Thomas, then who? The thought was terrifying, opening up a Pandora's box of possibilities she did not want to confront. The family remained outwardly composed in public, but the internal turmoil was immense. Sunday dinners at David and Martha's house became strained affairs, filled with awkward silences and forced conversation. The usual warmth was gone, replaced by a palpable tension that hung in the air like a thick fog. David continued to interact with both Thomas and Anne, attempting to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but his interactions with Anne seemed tinged with a new complexity, a mix of concern and something else, something she couldn't quite define. The seed of doubt, however small, had been planted, and it began to grow in the fertile ground of her fear and her husband's steadfast denial. The narrative was slowly pivoting, the focus starting to shift, however slightly, away from Thomas and towards the wider possibilities lurking within the family circle. The initial seemingly logical conclusion was beginning to fray at the edges, hinting at a deeper, more complex truth hidden beneath the surface of their fractured lives. The quiet suburban streets outside remained oblivious to the storm raging within the walls of their homes. As Anne grappled with her diagnosis and the escalating conflict with Thomas, a new, deeply unsettling possibility began to take root. Thomas's unwavering denial, coupled with certain subtle behaviors she had observed, caused her to reconsider her initial conclusion. She started looking back at the timeline, at the period before her symptoms began, at her interactions. Her relationship with Thomas had been monogamous. If not him, then who? The question was agonizing. Her thoughts inevitably turned to the people closest to her, the other individuals with whom she had shared intimacy of various forms. In her review, her thoughts settled, with a sickening lurch on David, her father-in-law. The memories of her increased time spent at David and Martha's house took on a new, horrifying dimension. The prolonged conversations, the moments alone, the subtle shifts in his demeanor towards her. What she had initially interpreted as paternal affection or simply friendly interaction now felt potentially sinister, viewed through the lens of her diagnosis and Thomas's denial. She revisited conversations with David, searching for anything that might have hinted at a deeper connection, anything that could possibly explain a route of transmission that bypassed Thomas. The thought was almost unbearable, a violation of trust and family bonds so profound it felt impossible. Yet the logic was starting to align in a terrifying way. If Thomas was not the source, and she had been monogamous with him, the source must lie outside their direct relationship, but within the sphere of her recent intimate contact. The horrifying possibility was that the intimate contact had occurred with David. She recalled specific instances, times when they were alone in the house, conversations that grew unexpectedly personal, physical proximity that felt slightly uncomfortable even at the time, but was dismissed as unintentional or familial. The memory of these moments, now viewed through the prism of her diagnosis and her developing suspicion, sent shivers down her spine. The contrast between David's public persona, the quiet, reserved, church-going man, and the possibility of a hidden, deeply transgressive act was immense. It felt impossible to reconcile the two images. Yet the question persisted, gnawing at her. She began to seek information about transmission, about risk factors, about timeline. While medical information is complex, the basic facts pointed clearly towards a recent transmission event. The period aligned more closely with the increased frequency of her visits to David and Martha's house and the developing dynamic with David than it did with any potential past exposure on Thomas's part that he denied. The narrative focus was undergoing a critical shift, moving away from the initial, plausible suspect to a far more shocking and devastating possibility. This period marked a crucial acceleration in the narrative, as Anne's internal investigation, driven by desperation and the need for answers, began to uncover the potential for a betrayal far more profound and damaging than she had initially conceived. The quiet suburban house, once a symbol of family stability, now felt like the potential scene of a hidden act that had unleashed unimaginable consequences, its walls holding a terrible secret. The suspicion against David, once a terrifying possibility, began to solidify in Anne's mind as she continued to review the timeline and her interactions. Thomas's consistent denial lent weight to the idea that he was not the source. The focus shifted entirely to David. Anne began to look for confirmation, for anything that could corroborate her horrifying suspicion. She did not immediately confront David or Thomas with this new, terrifying possibility. The implications were too immense, too destructive to the entire family structure. Instead, she proceeded cautiously, her mind working like an investigator's, piecing together fragments of memory, behavior, and logic. She considered the frequency and nature of her visits to David and Martha's house, the period she spent alone with David, the tenor of their conversations. She thought about David's reaction to her diagnosis and her accusation against Thomas, his guardedness, the subtle shifts in his demeanor that had struck her as odd even at the time. Could his reaction have been born not just of concern, but of guilt? She also considered any other potential sources, methodically ruling out possibilities based on her history and the known modes of transmission. With each eliminated possibility, the focus narrowed further onto David. The idea of confronting him directly was daunting. How do you ask your father-in-law if he is the reason you are dying? The emotional and psychological barrier was immense. The consequences of such an accusation, even if true, would be catastrophic, shattering the family, potentially destroying Thomas's relationship with his parents, and exposing a hidden life that defied all appearances. Yet, The need for truth, for understanding how this had happened, became paramount. Her initial belief that Thomas was the source had been a shield, a painful but somehow manageable explanation. The possibility of David being the source was a completely different order of magnitude, a violation of trust and family relationships that felt almost cosmic in its cruelty. She began to gather what limited information she could without raising alarm. This was not a formal investigation. It was a desperate search for answers driven by a medical crisis and a horrifying suspicion. Any confirmation would likely have to come from David himself, or from evidence that could only be obtained through direct confrontation or legal means, neither of which she was ready for. The tension within her grew, a silent scream trapped behind her composed exterior. She continued to navigate her life, managing her health, dealing with the distance from Thomas, all while harboring this terrible secret suspicion about David. The carefully maintained facade of the suburban Surmully was under immense pressure, the truth threatening to break through the surface and expose the rot beneath. The transition from suspecting her husband to suspecting her father-in-law marked a critical turning point, an acceleration of the narrative into darker, more complex territory, highlighting the depth of the hidden betrayal. The quiet streets of Carey remained untouched by the turmoil brewing within the walls of the family's homes, the secret still contained but straining against its boundaries. The emotional weight of her suspicion became unbearable. Anne decided she needed to speak to someone outside the immediate family circle, someone who could offer guidance and support without being directly involved in the family drama. She confided in a close friend, sharing the horrifying diagnosis and her evolving suspicion, explaining why she no longer believed Thomas was the source and how her attention had turned to David. The friend listened, shocked and distraught by the revelation. They discussed the implications, the difficulty of proving such a thing, and the devastating impact it would have. It became clear that getting definitive answers would be challenging. Without a confession from David, or evidence that could only be obtained through a formal investigation, the truth might remain elusive. Formal legal steps, such as filing a police report or pursuing a civil case, would require substantial evidence, and would immediately make the private tragedy a public spectacle, shattering the family's privacy irrevocably. There were no immediate plans for such actions, the emotional toll of the situation already immense. The focus remained, for the time being, on understanding what had happened and trying to navigate the personal fallout. As the days passed, Anne's interactions with David became increasingly difficult. She observed him closely, searching for any sign of guilt, any crack in his composure. Every glance, every word, every silence was scrutinized. The man she had once seen as a kind, if somewhat reserved, father-in-law now appeared potentially monstrous. The cognitive dissonance was immense. Attempting to reconcile the image of the man who tended his garden and attended church with the man she suspected of a profound and dangerous betrayal. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches. The interactions remained outwardly polite, strained by the unspoken knowledge and suspicion that hung in the air. David continued to act, from the outside, much as he always had. There was no visible sign of panic, no overt confession. His composure, whether genuine or a carefully constructed mask, added to Anne's turmoil. Was she misinterpreting everything? Was she projecting her pain and fear onto an innocent person? The doubt was paralyzing. Yet, the medical facts of her diagnosis and the timing of her symptoms remained undeniable. The narrative at this point was characterized by this internal struggle, the agonizing search for confirmation without the means to obtain it definitively. The tension lay in the unspoken accusation, the possibility that was slowly consuming Anne, contrasted with the outward appearance of a family dealing with illness, but not the true, horrifying source of it. The quiet of the suburban setting became oppressive, a backdrop for a silent drama of suspicion and devastating consequence. The secret remained hidden, a corrosive force eating away at the foundations of the family from within, while life on the quiet street continued, oblivious to the hidden truth that was destroying lives just behind the drawn curtain. The emotional and psychological burden on Anne was immense. Living with the diagnosis, the accusation against Thomas, and the horrifying suspicion about David, while trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy, was pushing her to her limits. She sought medical care for her condition, beginning treatment protocols that were complex and demanding. These appointments and treatments became a new, clinical layer to her life, a constant reminder of the devastating reality of her illness, and the search for its origin. Her relationship with Thomas remained fractured. Despite his continued denial, The accusation had created a deep wound. Their future together was uncertain, overshadowed by the diagnosis and the unresolved question of its source. Thomas, heartbroken and confused, struggled to understand how Anne could believe such a thing of him. His parents, particularly David, seemed to distance themselves, offering support that felt superficial and strained. The family was disintegrating, not with a sudden explosion, but with a slow, agonizing erosion of trust and connection. In this period of intense personal crisis, Anne focused on her health and on finding a way forward. The suspicion regarding David remained central, but the difficulty of obtaining proof felt insurmountable. Without direct evidence or a confession, it was her word, based on her interpretation of events and circumstances, against his potential denial. The legal ramifications of such an accusation were immense, requiring a level of certainty and proof that she did not yet possess. There were no formal investigations initiated by law enforcement based solely on Anne's suspicion. The focus remained within the private sphere of the family. The narrative shifted here to the long-term impact of the hidden truth. The diagnosis was a fact, but the source remained contested within the family, creating a perpetual state of turmoil. The physical reality of her illness was intertwined with the emotional reality of the betrayal, whether confirmed or only suspected. Anne had to navigate both, simultaneously managing her health and the devastating breakdown of her family relationships. The quiet house in Kerry, where the secrets had festered, remained a point of silent tension, a place where happy memories were now overshadowed by the possibility of profound violation. The carefully manicured lawn and neat curtains hid a reality of pain, suspicion, and shattered trust. The story became less about a search for a single climactic reveal, and more about the corrosive effect of a devastating truth, whether acknowledged or denied, on the lives of those involved. The lasting impact of the hidden act, and the subsequent accusation and suspicion, settled over the family like a permanent shadow, changing the nature of their interactions and their future irrevocably. This phase highlighted the devastating consequences of the undisclosed truth, demonstrating how a secret once revealed in its outcome, if not its origin, could destroy a family from within. The quiet suburban life that had once promised security was now a landscape of emotional devastation, haunted by the knowledge of what had transpired, or was believed to have transpired, behind closed doors. The lack of immediate definitive proof created a lingering uncertainty, a constant source of pain and unresolved conflict. The quiet devastation settled over the family like a permanent shroud. Anne continued her medical treatment, her life now irrevocably altered by the diagnosis. The battle was no longer just against the virus, but against the emotional fallout of betrayal and shattered trust. Her relationship with Thomas remained profoundly damaged, while the initial devastating accusation against him may have softened as her suspicion shifted. The process of accusation and the subsequent turmoil had created a rift that was seemingly impossible to bridge. They lived separate lives under the same roof, or eventually made arrangements to live apart, the shared future they had envisioned erased by a harsh medical reality, and the devastating secrets that had been exposed, or were suspected, within the family. Thomas struggled with the pain of Anne's illness and the accusation he had faced. His relationship with his parents, particularly David, was strained, complicated by the unspoken allegations and the palpable tension that existed whenever they were together. He was caught between his wife's suffering and his family's turmoil, unsure whom or what to believe, devastated by the destruction of his marriage and his family unit. Martha remained largely silent through the ordeal, her emotions hidden behind her usual composed exterior. What she knew or suspected remained her own secret, adding another layer of unspoken complexity to the family dynamic. Her quiet presence was a constant, passive reminder of the home, where the hidden events had potentially transpired. David, the man at the center of Anne's devastating suspicion, continued his life, maintaining his outward appearance of normalcy. He continued to tend his garden, attend church, interact with neighbors who remained unaware of the turmoil within his family. Whether he carried the burden of guilt or the weight of being falsely accused, his outward demeanor offered little insight. The truth of what transpired between him and Anne, and whether it was the source of her illness, remained a matter of private knowledge and suspicion, never fully exposed in a public or definitive way that brought resolution or accountability. There were no grand courtroom dramas depicted here, no definitive legal rulings that laid bare the facts for the world to see. The consequences played out within the confines of the family, a private tragedy of immense proportions. The house on the quiet street in Kerry, once a symbol of stability and family life, became a silent monument to what was lost. The family portraits on the mantelpiece, once depicting a scene of contentment, now served as a haunting reminder of a past that was far less perfect than it appeared, and a future that had been stolen. The lasting impact was the fragmentation of a family, the erosion of trust and the quiet suffering of individuals grappling with a reality too painful to fully confront or understand. The medical fact of Anne's illness was undeniable, but the human story of its origin and impact was one of devastating personal consequence, played out in the silence and sorrow of a suburban home. The quiet streets of Cary continued their rhythm, oblivious to the shattered lives just behind the drawn curtains, a haunting testament to the fact that even in the most seemingly normal places, profound darkness and betrayal can reside, leaving behind a legacy of pain and irreparable damage. The story concludes not with a resolution, but with the lingering sense of loss and the quiet, enduring pain of a family irrevocably broken by a hidden truth and its devastating fallout. The initial picture of suburban contentment was replaced by a grim reality, a testament to the fragility of appearances and the destructive power of secrets kept hidden in plain sight.